The rain had stopped just moments earlier, leaving behind the scent of wet asphalt and blooming jasmine along the edges of the city. The sky still hung heavy with gray, but the sun pushed gently through, casting slivers of light onto the bustling New York streets. People hurried past one another, clutching umbrellas and coffee cups, completely unaware of the story about to unfold in their midst. Richard Ellis, a 44-year-old self-made millionaire, stood beneath the ornate awning of Le Belvoir, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Manhattan. A man of calm demeanor and disciplined habits, he adjusted the silver cufflinks on his bespoke navy blue suit and glanced at his watch for the third time. Tonight wasn't just another dinner. It was a quiet celebration. Exactly 2 years ago, today he had met Catherine Gray, a woman who seemed to pull sunlight into every room she walked into. Inside, Catherine waited at their reserved corner table. A vision in a burgundy velvet dress, she was admired by many yet known by few. Richard had met her at a charity gala, one of the few events he attended not out of obligation, but genuine desire to give back. Catherine had been different, or so he believed. As he took a step toward the entrance, a small voice reached his ears. "Uncle, please, don't eat the cake." The voice was barely a whisper, trembling and urgent. Richard turned, startled. Just beside the decorative planter that flanked the restaurant steps stood a young girl, no more than 7. She had tangled hair, 2 thin arms, and eyes that looked far too old for her fragile frame. Her clothes were damp from the rain, patched and threadbare. She wasn't begging for food. She wasn't asking for money. She was warning him. "Excuse me?" he asked, stepping closer, eyebrows drawn together. The little girl looked up at him again, eyes wide and serious. "She put something in it," she said quietly. "In the cake. The woman with the pretty hair." Richard stared at her. The child's lips trembled, but her voice was steady. There was no deceit, no drama, just a chilling calm that made his skin prickle. "You know Catherine?" he asked carefully. The girl nodded, her gaze flickering toward the glass doors of the restaurant, then back to him. "She told the man with the jacket. I heard her. She said she just needed you to eat it, and everything would be over." Richard's mind stilled. The logical part of him wrestled with reason. This was absurd, wasn't it? A stranger's child standing outside an elite restaurant making claims about the woman he had planned to propose to tonight. But something in the girl's expression, in the way her shoulders tensed and her breathing grew shallower as he hesitated, rooted him in place. "What's your name?" he asked softly, crouching to meet her at eye level. "Sylvie," she replied, gripping the frayed sleeve of her coat tightly. "I didn't mean to hear it. I was just hiding because I was cold. But I heard her. She was laughing when she said it." Richard's heart pounded. He didn't know what to think. But one thing was certain. This wasn't a coincidence. And if even a shadow of what Sylvie said was true, he needed to proceed carefully. He stood up, glancing once more at the restaurant. The maitre d' inside spotted him and gave a polite wave, indicating that Catherine was waiting. Richard nodded, then turned back to Sylvie. "Do you have someone looking after you?" he asked. She shook her head. "No. My sister used to, but she's gone." Gone. It hit him harder than it should have. "All right," he said after a pause. "Stay right here, okay? Don't go anywhere." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small notepad and pen. Writing down his number, he handed it to her. "If anything happens, if anyone comes near you, call this number. It'll reach me or my assistant. Understand?" Sylvie took the note and nodded. With a heavy heart, Richard walked into Le Belvoir. The warmth and opulence of the restaurant felt jarring after the encounter outside. Candlelight flickered against crystal glasses. Violin music floated in the background. Catherine rose from her seat with a bright smile as he approached, her blonde curls falling elegantly over one shoulder. "You look tense," she said sweetly, as he leaned down to kiss her cheek. "Just a long day," he replied. They ordered dinner. The conversation flowed easily. Catherine was as charming and graceful as ever. She laughed at the right moments, complimented the chef, asked about Richard's upcoming foundation launch. But through it all, his mind was elsewhere. On Sylvie, on the words she had spoken. And then, the cake arrived. It was Catherine's idea. "It's your favorite, triple dark chocolate with hazelnut cream." She smiled. "I thought it would be the perfect way to end the night." The waiter placed the cake on the table with practiced finesse. Richard watched her closely as she leaned in. "A toast first," she said, lifting her wineglass. He lifted his as well. "To what?" "To new beginnings," she replied, her voice silky. The words sent a ripple of unease down his spine. He glanced at the cake, then at her. And for just a moment, only a flash, he saw her eyes shift. Not in the way someone admiring. A dessert might, but calculating. Observing, Richard set down his fork. "Is something wrong?" she asked, tilting her head. "Actually, yes," he said, voice calm. "There's a little girl outside. She said something strange to me before I walked in." Catherine's smile faltered for a heartbeat. "A child? Outside this place? That's unusual." "She said you put something in the cake." There was a pause. Not long, just long enough. And then, Catherine laughed. "Oh, Richard. Are you being serious?" she said, amusement lacing her tone. "You can't be. Surely you're not taking the word of some street urchin over me." Her words were smooth, polished. But Richard wasn't listening to what she said anymore. He was listening to how she said it, and what she didn't say. "I need a moment," he murmured, rising from his chair. He stepped away from the table, signaling for the manager discreetly. Outside, Sylvie still sat by the planter, her small frame huddled into itself. He walked straight to her. "I need you to come inside for a moment," he said gently. "There are people who need to hear what you told me." Her eyes widened. "Will I get in trouble?" "No," he said, kneeling beside her. "You might just be saving someone's life." Back inside, the manager led them into a private lounge. Catherine was already standing when Richard returned, her expression unreadable. "What's going on?" she asked, voice sharper now. "This little girl has something to say," Richard said. "I think it's important that we all listen." Catherine's smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sylvie," Richard said softly, "tell them what you told me." And Sylvie did, every word, calmly, clearly. With details Richard hadn't even remembered, like the color of the man's coat Catherine had spoken to, the way she described the plan, the exact time she had overheard them. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Catherine's hands trembled slightly. "This is ridiculous," she said. "She's making it up. You're all believing the story of a homeless child over me?" "She knew things she shouldn't know," Richard said, his voice steady now. "Things I never told anyone, like the brand of chocolate I prefer. Or that you mentioned this was our anniversary." Catherine opened her mouth, then closed it. The manager stepped forward. "Sir, should we call the authorities?" Richard shook his head slowly. "Not yet." He turned to Catherine. "If there's anything you want to say, now's the time." Catherine looked at the girl, then at Richard. Then, without another word, she picked up her clutch and walked out of the lounge. Richard didn't stop her. He sat beside Sylvie, overwhelmed not by betrayal but by something else, gratitude. "You were very brave," he said to her. She nodded. "I just didn't want you to get hurt." "Why me?" She looked down at her hands. "You looked kind. Like my sister used to say, kind people have tired eyes. And you looked tired." Richard smiled for the first time that night. "Come with me," he said gently. "We'll get you something warm to eat, and maybe figure out what comes next. Together." And that moment, simple, quiet, and powerful, was where everything began to change. The silence in the car was filled only by the gentle hum of the engine and the patter of the rain returning in soft waves. Richard glanced in the rearview mirror, and saw Sylvie curled up in the passenger seat, her small fingers wrapped around a cup of hot cocoa he'd picked up from a nearby cafe. She didn't speak much, but she didn't need to. Her presence spoke volumes. Richard couldn't stop replaying the evening in his head. The look in Catherine's eyes when she realized she'd been caught, the way she chose silence over explanation, and Sylvie's unwavering courage, her voice steady despite the weight of what she'd witnessed. As they pulled into the underground garage of his apartment complex, he turned to her. "We're home," he said, not entirely sure why those words sounded different tonight. Sylvie's eyes widened as she looked around. The tall ceilings, the shimmering lights in the lobby, the marble floors. It was all a world she'd never stepped into. She walked beside Richard quietly, not touching anything, but her eyes drank in every detail. "Do you live here alone?" she asked softly. "I do," he answered, unlocking the door to his penthouse. "But I suppose not anymore." The inside was warm, cozy, and filled with soft lighting and the scent of cedarwood. Sylvie stepped in cautiously like she was afraid to leave footprints on the floor. Richard took her coat and handed her a soft blanket from the sofa. "You can sit anywhere you like," he said with a gentle smile. She sat at the edge of the couch, barely pressing her weight into it. He noticed how thin she was, how sharp her collarbones were. "When was the last time you had a real meal?" he asked. She looked away, then answered, "Yesterday, I had a piece of bread, from a bakery bin." Richard swallowed the tightness in his throat and walked to the kitchen. Within 20 minutes, he returned with a tray, warm soup, a buttered roll, slices of fruit, and a piece of grilled cheese. Sylvie blinked at the tray like it was a treasure chest. "For me?" she whispered. "All for you." She didn't rush. She didn't devour it like he expected. She took small, careful bites, always glancing up at him, as if waiting for the moment it might all disappear. As she ate, Richard sat across from her, wondering about this girl who had appeared in his life like a spark in the night. "Where's your sister now?" he asked softly. Sylvie paused mid-bite. Her eyes darkened. "She got sick. She tried to get help, but no one would take us. Said we didn't have insurance. She died in the winter. I stayed in the shelter, but someone there scared me. So I left." Richard's heart clenched. He leaned back in his chair, not knowing what to say to a story no child should have to tell. "And your parents? They left when I was a baby. I never met them. So much pain, so much loss, yet here she was, courageous, kind, and wise beyond her years." "I'll make some calls tomorrow," he said. "There are good people, honest people. We'll find someone who can help properly." She looked up at him, her voice trembling now. "Will I have to go away?" Richard hesitated. "No," he said after a pause. "Not unless you want to." She gave a tiny nod, and her eyes glistened with something he hadn't seen before. Relief. That night, he made a bed for her in the guest room. She fell asleep quickly, still wrapped in the blanket he gave her, her little face peaceful for the first time in what felt like forever. Richard stood at the door watching her breathe. He didn't know what had drawn her to him, or why fate had chosen this night of all nights to break everything he knew and rebuild it differently. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn away now. The next morning came with gold-streaked skies and the smell of pancakes. Sylvie appeared in the doorway, her hair combed back with the brush he'd left on the counter. "You made breakfast?" she asked, eyes bright. He chuckled. "It's not as fancy as the restaurant, but I think it's better." As they sat and ate, Richard's phone buzzed. It was his assistant, Miriam. He stepped into the hall to answer. "Sir, we have a situation," she said immediately. "About Catherine. You need to see this." "What happened?" "She was caught trying to leave the country this morning. Security flagged her at the private terminal. Turns out she tried to wire a large sum of your money out of the joint charity account into an offshore one." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "How much?" $3 million. A long pause. "I'll handle it," he said, and hung up. He walked back into the kitchen, where Sylvie was now humming quietly while tracing the edge of her plate. Do you like it here? He asked. She nodded. It feels safe. He sat beside her. Well, I've got a question for you, he said. How would you feel about staying here a little longer? Not just as a guest, but as part of my family. Her spoon clattered slightly on the table. Like, you want to adopt me? If that's something you want. I know we just met, and it's early, but I don't think what happened last night was an accident. I think you came into my life for a reason. And if you'll let me, I'd like to protect you, not just for a night, for good. Tears brimmed in her eyes. Really? Really? She ran into his arms, and for the first time in a very long while, Richard felt whole. Not because of money, success, or status, but because of the quiet heartbeat of a little girl who reminded him that the strongest people are often the smallest. And somewhere, in that penthouse filled with silence and second chances, something beautiful began. A bond not built by blood, but by bravery. A week passed, and with each new day, Richard found pieces of himself he didn't know were missing. Sylvie had a quiet rhythm to her mornings. She liked to water the little balcony plants with the precision of a botanist and lined up her shoes neatly by the door each night. She never asked for much, just a story before bed, a warm meal, and a promise that she was safe. In return, she gave Richard something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, but peace, he knew, was often temporary. It was a Thursday morning when Richard received the official report from his private investigator. Catherine had not only planned to steal millions, but had been secretly meeting with one of his closest board members. Betrayal was always bitter, but this time it felt personal. He stood by the window, the city buzzing far below, the folder trembling in his hands. Sylvie entered quietly, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate, one with extra marshmallows, just how she'd noticed he liked it. You look like your heart is somewhere else, she said gently. He smiled at her phrasing. She always spoke like an old soul trapped in a child's body. I just found out someone I trusted didn't deserve that trust. Sylvie set the mugs down and reached for his hand. You still have me, and I don't lie. He looked at her, his throat tight. No, you don't. That afternoon he met with his legal team. Steps had to be taken. Money needed to be frozen. Names needed to be erased from documents. Catherine would face consequences, not out of revenge, but to protect everything he'd built. But as he left the conference room, he caught himself staring at a framed photo on the wall, a charity gala from years ago. In the center, surrounded by executives and city leaders, was a much younger Richard, his smile wide, his eyes clear. He missed that man. Later that evening, while Sylvie was sketching pictures of stars and houses with warm yellow lights, Richard knelt beside her. What are you drawing? She looked up. A home that never locks its doors. He blinked. Why? Because the people inside aren't afraid. He sat back. Were you always this wise? Sylvie shrugged. I had to learn fast. When you're on the streets, grown-ups don't listen unless you say something smart. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside wasn't jewelry, but something far more valuable, a pendant with the initials RW, engraved beside a tiny symbol of an anchor. This belonged to my mother, he said softly. She gave it to me when I was very young, told me to wear it when I needed to feel strong. I think you need it more than I do now. Sylvie stared, at the necklace, then at him. But this is yours. And now it's yours. She held it close. Thank you. I'll keep it safe. The days turned into quiet routines. School papers, bedtime books, simple breakfasts that tasted better because of laughter. But then something changed. A stranger appeared outside the building, twice in 1 week. He never approached, just stood by the gate, watching. The doorman mentioned it casually, but Richard's gut told him it was no coincidence. He asked for the security footage. The man was middle-aged, unshaven, and always wore the same coat. Sylvie saw the image over his shoulder. I know him, she said, her voice small. Richard turned quickly. Who is he? He used to come to the shelter. He'd give some of the kids food, but sometimes he took them away. Took them? Sylvie nodded, her hands now gripping the pendant. He scared me. My sister said not to talk to him. Then one day she went to find food and never came back. Richard's blood ran cold. The investigation into Catherine had been enough to stir enemies, but this was something darker. He called his head of security. I want extra guards on the building, and I want that man found. That night, Sylvie didn't sleep in the guest room. She climbed into the bed beside Richard without saying a word, and he didn't send her back. Door. Next morning, the security team had a name. The man was connected to a ring that preyed on vulnerable children. The same group Catherine had once donated to. On paper, a shelter, but in reality, something far more sinister. The threads were unraveling. Richard sat down with Sylvie and told her everything. Not because he wanted to scare her, but because he believed she deserved the truth. I think Catherine was involved, he said carefully. Not just with stealing money, but with that group, and she may have been watching you for them. Sylvie didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply looked up and said, "Then we need to stop them." He smiled, heart heavy but proud. "Yes, we do." Richard made a decision that day, one that would shift the direction of his entire empire. He would use every resource, every connection, every dollar he had to take down the people who hurt children like Sylvie. Not just for her, but for every child who'd never been heard, and he wouldn't stop until they were exposed. The sun hadn't even risen when Richard stood alone in his private office, staring out over a city still wrapped in sleep. He held a cup of black coffee in one hand, but the warmth didn't reach his bones. Everything inside him felt like a storm waiting to break. The documents spread across his desk weren't business reports or investment summaries. They were names, addresses, financial records, silent connections between charities and shell companies. Every line told a darker story than the last. Sylvie's words the night before still echoed in his mind. Then we need to stop them. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a politician. But he was something else. A man with the means, the reach, and now, finally, the purpose. By 8 a.m., his private legal team, cybersecurity expert, and a former federal investigator were all sitting across from him. "I don't want noise," Richard said firmly. "I want action, quiet, legal, and final. These people prey on children, and they've used my name, my money, and my network to hide. I want them exposed." "Are you sure you want to go public?" one of his lawyers asked. "Once this leaks, it could drag your name through every headline. Even if you're innocent, the damage—" "I'm not thinking about headlines," Richard interrupted. "I'm thinking about a little girl who warned me not to eat a poisoned cake. She deserves to be heard and protected. That's all that matters now." While the team launched their operation, Sylvie sat in a quiet room upstairs with a child therapist Richard had brought in, someone warm, gentle, and trusted. She spoke softly, her drawings flowing more freely than her words. But in every page, sketched, with crayons and quiet courage, were clues. The man at the shelter, a woman with a ring that had a scar on her hand, a basement with a green door. Richard reviewed every image personally. 2 days later, a breakthrough came. The green door was traced to an abandoned facility once registered as a youth center in Queens. The charity had since changed hands multiple times, but through a network of offshore accounts and renamed boards, it linked back, indirectly, to Catherine Miller. Richard stood silent when the team confirmed it. He wasn't surprised, just devastated. "I trusted her," he said quietly. "I thought she was helping me build something good." Sylvie, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped inside. "Sometimes bad people pretend better than the good ones." Richard looked at her. "How are you always right?" She shrugged. "I just see things." Later that night, as Sylvie drifted off beside her stuffed bear, one Richard had impulsively bought from a corner store, his phone rang. It was Miriam, his assistant. "Sir, you're not going to believe this," she said. "Catherine just gave an interview. She's flipping the narrative." "What?" "She's claiming you're emotionally unstable, that you fabricated the embezzlement because she ended the relationship." Richard stood frozen. "And the news is running this?" "It's gaining traction. One outlet picked it up already." A sharp breath left him. He walked to the balcony, letting the night air cool the fire in his chest. So that's how it was going to be. She wasn't just trying to ruin his reputation, she was trying to silence the truth before it could rise. But this time she underestimated him. The next morning, Richard called a press conference, not in a marble hall or on a TV set, but in the heart of his foundation's headquarters, in front of the very wall lined with photos of children who had been helped over the years. He didn't prepare a script. He didn't rehearse a statement. He looked directly into the cameras and spoke from a place deeper than wealth or pride. "I built my company from nothing, but some things are more important than profit. Last week I was warned, by a child, that someone I loved had betrayed me. What followed was a trail of evidence connecting that person to illegal activities, targeting children under the guise of charity." He paused. "I was heartbroken, but I won't be silent." Reporters fired questions. He answered them all. He named names, carefully, only after his legal team cleared every fact. He announced that his foundation would fund a new task force, working with child protection agencies to uncover and shut down hidden abuse networks. And then, just before the cameras turned off, he said, "There is a child at the center of this. A girl who's shown more bravery than most adults I know. She saved me, and now I will protect her with everything I have." The video went viral within hours, not because Richard was rich, but because his voice was real. By nightfall, messages flooded in from parents, survivors, teachers, and strangers around the world, and in a quiet room, Sylvie watched her new guardian speak on TV. Her small hands clutched the pendant around her neck. "I told the truth," she whispered to the screen, "and he believed me." Richard entered the room and sat beside her. "You did more than tell the truth," he said. "You changed everything." Outside, the world raged with opinions and debates. But in that apartment, between two souls connected, not by blood but by bravery, there was only calm. They didn't know what the next day would bring. But they had each other, and that was a beginning strong enough to face anything. The morning after the press conference, the world looked different. Richard wasn't just a billionaire anymore. He had become a symbol, a man willing to stand in front of cameras not to defend his empire but to protect a single scared child. It rattled people, inspired them, challenged them, but not everyone applauded. Threats began to arrive. First, anonymous emails. Then letters slipped into the lobby. One note was taped to the gate with childlike handwriting. "Stop talking or she disappears." Richard stared at the note with a clenched jaw. His security team urged him to move Sylvie to a secure facility. But he refused. "She's not a witness, she's a little girl, she deserves a home, not a cell." Still, precautions were tightened. Guards at every corner, security cameras, check-ins, decoy cars, and inside the penthouse a sense of vigilance replaced the calm. Yet Sylvie remained unchanged. She still giggled when she saw pancakes in funny shapes, still asked strange, deep questions like, "Do shadows ever get tired?" And still every night she whispered to the pendant at her neck before sleep as if it listened. But one night her voice broke. "I miss my sister," she said suddenly, as Richard tucked her in. "I never even got to say goodbye." He sat beside her, gently brushing hair from her forehead. "Do you want to talk about her?" Sylvie nodded slowly. "Her name was Mia. She was older, not by much, but she always said I was the brave one." "Why?" "Because I saw things, heard things, and I wasn't afraid to tell. She wanted to run away. She tried to get help. That's when she disappeared." Richard's heart ached. "Do you think the man outside took her?" "I don't know," she whispered, "but I think he knows where she is." The next morning, Richard gave the order. "Find Mia." It became a new mission layered beneath the first: quiet inquiries, database searches. Missing persons cases, shelter logs, hospitals, social services. Weeks passed with no sign, and just as the trail seemed to cool, a nurse from a small clinic in Brooklyn called the foundation. "There was a girl," she said. 5 months ago. No ID, hurt, scared. Called herself Mia. Richard personally went to the clinic with a recent photo of Sylvie. The nurse looked at it and gasped, hand over her mouth. "That's her sister. Same eyes, same way of speaking. I remember because she kept asking for crayons and wouldn't eat unless we sang." Richard's pulse surged. "Where is she now?" "She ran away. Said someone was coming for her. We haven't seen her since." But that tiny spark was enough. His team combed street camera footage, cross-referenced patterns, mapped out shelters she might have gone to. For days, Richard barely slept, going over every lead like it was life or death, because to Sylvie, it was. And then came the breakthrough. An old city bus camera caught a glimpse of a girl, hooded, limping slightly, entering a warehouse near the docks. The photo was grainy, but Richard knew. He knew it was her. They moved fast. He brought in the police, but discreetly. No media, no noise, just heartbeats and resolve. The warehouse raid was swift. The man who had been watching Sylvie was there, armed, cornered, arrested, and in the back room behind crates and rusted metal doors was a girl wrapped in a blanket. "Mia?" Richard said gently, stepping into the dark. She flinched but didn't run. Her face, pale and hollowed, tilted toward him. "I'm not going back," she whispered. "Not to them." "You don't have to," he said, voice soft but sure. "I'm here for Sylvie, and for you." At the mention of her sister, her eyes filled with tears. "She's alive. She saved me," Richard said. "And now it's my turn." Mia collapsed into his arms, the strength drained from her bones. That night, Sylvie stood frozen as the elevator doors opened and her sister stepped inside. There were no dramatic screams or loud cries, just two children rushing into each other's. Arms like broken pieces finally made whole. Mia clung to her little sister. "You wore the necklace," she murmured. "I told you I'd keep it safe." Richard watched from a distance, eyes glassy, throat tight. He had seen business deals worth billions, but nothing compared to the value of this moment. Two sisters, together again. That weekend he cleared his entire schedule and took the girls to the countryside. Somewhere quiet, away from the cameras, just trees, a lake, and healing. Mia spoke, more each day, about the things she saw, the people who hurt others, and how she ran because she didn't think anyone would come. Sylvie sat beside her every time, holding her hand. "You don't have to be afraid now," she whispered. "We have him. Him, Richard, who was now something far more than a man, in a suit. He was protector, guardian, family." On the final evening of their trip, as the sun dipped below the hills, the girls ran barefoot through the grass while Richard watched from the porch, a warm drink in his hands. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. Not the public smile, but a real one, because in the end, the truth had found light. Justice had a face, and two little girls had found their way back to safety. The gala was meant to be grand. Red carpet rolled, cameras flashed. The ballroom glistened with crystal chandeliers, and the finest names in philanthropy had gathered. Not just to dine, not just to be seen, but to stand behind a cause that had shaken the city to its core, protecting children who had fallen through the cracks of the system. At the center of it all was Richard, not the businessman, not the billionaire, but the man who had listened when a forgotten child whispered the truth. As he stood at the podium, his eyes swept over the crowd, investors, celebrities, politicians, and strangers who'd once doubted him, but now leaned in with reverence. His speech wasn't rehearsed. It didn't need to be. His life had become the message. "I once believed success was about building empires, but I learned it's about building trust. about listening to voices the world ignores. Tonight is not about wealth, it's about worth. And no child should have to prove they are worthy of love, of safety, of being believed. The room erupted in quiet applause. Not the kind that filled silence, but the kind that acknowledged truth. And in the front row, Sylvie and Mia sat holding hands, their dresses simple, their expressions proud. They were still healing. Scars lingered, some visible, some buried. But they were safe, and more than that, they were seen. After the speech, as donors mingled and waiters floated through the crowd, Sylvie tugged Richard's sleeve. "Can I talk to you?" He crouched to her level. "Always." "I want to do something," she said, "for other kids like me, like Mia, like the ones who don't have anyone yet." Richard smiled. "You already have, you changed everything." "But that's not enough." Her voice was steady, stronger than ever. "I want to start a place, a home, not like a shelter, a real home with books and art and people who listen." He blinked, stunned, then slowly nodded. "Then let's build it, together," they called it the Whisper House. Not because of silence, but because some of the strongest truths come in the quietest voices. It opened 6 months later. Painted walls, open gardens, therapy dogs, music rooms, teachers who cared more about hearts than grades. Kids came in afraid, and slowly, they began to laugh again. The first mural on the wall was painted by Sylvie. It showed a little girl pointing at a cake and a man who listened. 1 year later, on a cloudy spring morning, Richard received a letter. No return address. Just a child's handwriting. "Thank you for believing me even when I was invisible. Now I believe in me too." He kept that letter in his wallet. Mia went on to speak at forums for missing children. Her voice, once broken by silence, now lit stages with strength. Sylvie became something of a quiet legend, a girl with a necklace and a heart that saved not just a man, but a movement. And Richard? He never returned to his old life. He still wore suits, still made deals. But every business he touched now echoed his new purpose, building things that protected, that empowered, that gave back. He often said, "The best thing I ever did wasn't earn my first billion. It was hearing a whisper that changed everything." Years passed. One day, as Sylvie stood on the front steps of the Whisper House, watching a new child arrive for the first time, frightened, small, unsure, she knelt and smiled. "Hi," she said softly. "This place saved me once. And now, it's yours too." Because the smallest voice had once warned of a danger no one else saw, and that voice had sparked a wave that turned fear into hope, betrayal into justice, and silence into something unforgettable. In the end, the little beggar's warning didn't just save a man from a poisoned cake, it saved his soul. And in return, he gave her the world.